This story begins in Brazil, and the man you're looking at disrupted the lives of most Latin Americans. He is not a prominent businessman, nor an important politician. He is just a dollar exchanger. His name is Alberto Youssef, Brazilian of Arab origin, but he keeps a very dark secret and, as you will see in this video, quite explosive. In February 2014, authorities arrested him regarding his possible involvement in a money laundering case using a gas station in Brasilia, Brazil's capital city. Youssef agrees to cooperate with the authorities, but gives his lawyers a serious warning. "If I talk, the republic will fall." Alberto's words were an understatement, and this would be only the beginning of the uncovering of a plot with ramifications in Latin America, the United States, and even Africa. This is the Odebrecht case, the largest international corruption scandal in history. But who are the protagonists of this story? And how did this company manage to spread its tentacles around the world? How did it come out of Brazil to obtain impressive but ill-gotten profits in the public works sector in countries like the Dominican Republic, Mexico, the United States, Angola, and many others? The Odebrecht company was founded in 1944 by Norberto Odebrecht. He came from a long family tradition in the construction sector, with outstanding achievements in the area of public works in the northern states of Brazil. Norberto was the son of Emilio Odebrecht, one of the pioneers in Brazil of the use of reinforced cement. From the beginning, Norberto had to deal with difficult situations typical of his line of business, but over the years the business expanded and grew until it became a regional benchmark, an example of quality, efficiency, and good budget management. Those who knew him defined Norberto as a simple, reserved man who worked a lot and talked little. But in the 1950s, Norberto and his company suffered a painful disappointment, and some speculate that the lessons learned from this defeat were the seed that started the monster that eventually became the corrupt Odebrecht that we remember today. It happened in 1956, during the administration of President Juscelino Kubitschek.
Brasília a irradiar-se para o norte, para o centro e para o sul.
The country embarked on the construction of a new city, Brasilia, which would be its new capital. Even to this day, one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in history. The country mobilized enormous amounts of public money to materialize what had been a central piece of his campaign promises. A golden age was approaching, and many believed it was unrepeatable to make a fortune with construction. Sadly, the very efficient and exemplary company Norberto Odebrecht was left out. Despite all his attempts, Norberto received a door slammed in his face. He was excluded from that super mega project, which was the dream of everyone who worked in the field of construction, from construction firms to engineers. And what was the reason? According to Norberto, the lesson was very clear. He told his team that it was due to the lack of political support for him and his company. Back then, there existed in the country a select club of construction companies that carried out the largest projects: Mendes Jr., Camargo Correa, Setenco, Andrade Gutierrez. And to protect the market, there was a law that required that to participate in such projects, it was essential to have previous experience in similar projects. It was a regulatory wall that prevented the participation of smaller companies in large contracts with the state. Norberto did everything he could to find a gap without success. This was a very hard blow, a great disappointment, but the conclusions that the family drew were that in order to sit at the table with the big guys, with the big boys, the most important thing was to gain political favor. The other businessmen referred to his company in a derogatory manner as the Bahians, because they came from the city of Salvador in the northern state of Bahia, a much more modest city compared to Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro. However, ironically, the fact of coming from the far north of Brazil eventually ended up being the gateway for Odebrecht to that select club that it so longed to gain access to. It turns out that Bahia had been underestimated. The oil discoveries in this state and in others in northern Brazil, which had not been seriously exploited, underwent a change in the 1950s, and as the years went by, the changes accelerated. The Brazilian government creates Petróleo Brasileiro, Petrobras, with the mission of exploiting the oil fields in the north of the country. And Salvador de Bahia was one of the places where the oil company had the greatest presence, the same place where Odebrecht had its headquarters. The construction company started modestly, building just a camp for workers who were building an oil pipeline. Then a refinery. Then it was granted the right to build the Petrobras corporate building in Salvador, Bahia. From here, a long and close relationship between Petrobras and Odebrecht began. In 1966, under the military dictatorship, President Humberto Castelo Branco ordered the construction of the national headquarters of Petrobras in Rio de Janeiro, a large-scale project in which Odebrecht, which by then was well connected with both Petrobras and the military regime, was allowed to participate. These projects cost, at that time, $80 million, more than $670 million calculated at 2023 values. At last, the Bahians, who had been despised less than a decade ago, had managed to leave their provinciality to rub shoulders with the big ones. But the great change of fortune would happen to Norberto in November 1969, when the Petrobras headquarters were still under construction. A military man named Ernesto Geisel takes over the administration of the oil company, and advised by his team, he immediately introduces changes in the design of the building that required the use of materials not originally budgeted for and which began to cause serious losses to Odebrecht. The construction company urgently needed the payment formula to be recalculated so that it would take into account the new costs, which Petrobras refused. The soldier and the businessman held a meeting in Rio de Janeiro. "My staff tells me that you are losing money because of your incompetence," Geisel told Norberto. "How much time do I have to show you that I am right?" Norberto replied. "You have 15 days, said Geisel. Norberto returned within the established deadline loaded with blueprints and documents, and his arguments managed to convince Geisel. From this event on, Ernesto Geisel, who would years later become president of Brazil, and Norberto Odebrecht would hold periodic meetings where, apart from talking about the project, they would hold long talks on social, political, and economic issues. Both of them were of German descent and shared similarities in the customs under which they were raised. The relationship between the soldier and the businessman became very close. At last, Norberto Odebrecht had achieved political support at the highest levels of government. Under the military dictatorship, Odebrecht achieved important support and was granted many other large-scale projects, such as the main airport in Rio de Janeiro. The regime awarded Odebrecht the contract for the Angra 1 nuclear plant, a sensitive project with national security implications. The fact that the military handed over such a sensitive project to Odebrecht makes it clear how close to power the company had become. But already, signs of the company's modus operandi in the future were beginning to be seen. The plant ended up costing several times the initially budgeted cost. The highest estimates placed the cost overrun at more than 3,000%. Something quite controversial happened with the airport. In 1971, Odebrecht participated and won in the bidding for Rio's new airport and defeated larger construction companies from the city of Sao Paulo, such as Camargo Correa and CBPO. However, a company that had carried out the technical studies for the project proposed to disqualify Odebrecht because it did not have the certifications nor the experience to build such a structure. This is when Norberto turns to his friend Ernesto Geisel to avoid being disqualified. "I would like to have your support," he said. Geisel sent for the person in charge of the bidding process, and right there in front of Norberto, he told him, "If I were you, I would give the job to that naughty Bahian. He complains a lot, but he delivers on everything he promises." Odebrecht ended up building the project. Right there, he could see that in the world of government contracts, the technical or environmental studies, the rules, they didn't matter much. In the end, everything was subordinated to the will of an official with the necessary authority. But luck continued to smile on him when Ernesto Geisel became the president of Brazil in 1974, and with this more and bigger contracts for Norberto and his company. Norberto wrote extensively about his business strategy, where in quite ambiguous language he spoke about the importance of establishing cooperation strategies between the political class and the business class. The contracts obtained during the military dictatorship took Odebrecht from the 19th place in the national ranking in 1971 to number 2 in less than 10 years. Norberto's company had become one of the undisputed leaders in the field of construction, in one of the largest and most populous countries in the world. All of this in less than 10 years. What a leap! In 1991, Norberto handed over the leadership of the company to his son Emilio Alves, who managed the company until 2002 and followed the model of consolidating the company's political relationships. In 1998, Emilio Alves received the Order of Military Merit from the then interim president Antonio Carlos Magallanes. In 2004, he was promoted to the rank of Grand Officer by then President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Emilio, who was said to have a much more extroverted and party-loving personality than his father, emphasized the aspect of personal relationships with political powers. For him, friend-type relationships with the political class were as important as having business relationships with them. He was prone to giving presents and organizing parties and social events for these elites, something that his father Norberto always saw with displeasure. In 1981, Odebrecht had purchased CBPO, one of the most emblematic construction companies in Brazil, based in Sao Paulo, its largest city. Emilio had traveled to Sao Paulo to assume the position of vice president of the company. On that trip, he was able to perceive that for the elite of Sao Paulo, the Bahians were not yet accepted or viewed very well. When attending a social event in an auditorium with 400 people from Sao Paulo's upper class, Emilio would narrate for decades how he and his wife felt, receiving hostile looks and gestures of contempt from the attendees. that perception of rejection never left the members of the Odebrecht family, not even decades later, when they were much richer and more powerful than their competitors. Already in 1980, the company had a list of more than 400 codenames of regular recipients of bribes. Emilio was the pioneer of the practice of simultaneously financing rival political candidates who were competing for the same position. And to further consolidate his influence, he would finance leaders of opposing social groups. For example, in the 80s, Emilio Odebrecht clandestinely financed repressive groups within the military, and at the same time, he financed the unions that opposed them. But in order to finance the latter, he needed an intermediary. It is then that he became involved with a fervent union leader of the time, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula's relationship with the Odebrecht family would extend for decades, even beyond his presidency, and it is during Lula's governments that the company's revenue skyrockets, and Odebrecht reaches the #1 position in the construction business in Brazil. His son Marcelo Odebrecht took the reins of the company in 2009, and by the beginning of 2016, the Odebrecht family had reached the peak of its economic and political power. In our next video, we will see how the company fell down in such a spectacular way that multiple governments across the region went down with it. Subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss this nor other interesting videos about Latin America. This is Latinometry. Please like and share this video, and thanks for watching.